Good morning, everyone. My name's David Golder, and I'm chair of JFNA's Domestic Policy and Government Affairs Council, and I want to welcome all of you to this advocacy workshop. For those not familiar with the DPGA, we are the JFNA board governance organization that oversees our work in public affairs. Our extraordinary public affairs team works on a diverse set of priorities critical to our Federation communities, including advocacy with the federal government on health and human services for at-risk populations, fighting anti-Semitism and BDS, building a diverse and inclusive Jewish community, providing support to Holocaust survivors and other victims of trauma, and supporting relationships with other communities around issues of mutual interest. Our mission and our efforts have never been more important or more tested as they have been during this COVID-19 period. Certainly the most serious public health emergency this nation has ever faced in over a century, and possibly the most extreme economic crisis since the Great Depression. JFNA, our local federations, independent network communities, and our partner agencies have played a pivotal role on the front lines in delivering life-saving care to people in need from all walks of life and all ages. COVID relief, access locally and nationally, has been critical in helping our stakeholders persevere and ensuring that they can help the vulnerable people that we all serve. In particular, the creation of the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, provided existential support to many of our agencies, allowing them to remain open. Our collective advocacy from JFNA, and with all this, the support of all of you, was instrumental in helping create both the program and ensuring that JFS agencies and nursing homes that receive Medicaid funds were eligible for that program. Collectively, our institutions have accessed many hundreds of millions of dollars of funding from the PPP. Simultaneously, while focused on COVID relief, we are also working to access the public resources that we depend on year in and year out through our traditional public-private partnerships. This has allowed us to provide health and long-term care for low-income seniors and persons with disabilities, congregate and home-delivered meals, and security through the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. And these are just a few examples among so many different funding streams that are available to our community. We estimate that normally in the US, we access approximately $10 billion each year in public funds from all levels of government. This helps fuel the exemplary social services that our system provides. The tension between the existential threat posed by COVID and the need to safeguard those ongoing resources that help us care for the most vulnerable every day is what we're going to talk about today. Our challenge and challenges only strengthen the case as to why we need the strongest possible public policy engagement from our communities. This session will focus on how, as concerned and dedicated members of the Jewish community, we can better engage our public officials on those pressing topics and help ensure that you have the tools necessary to effectuate meaningful change in Washington or Ottawa, in your state capital, or in a provincial capital in Canada and locally. We've assembled an outstanding group of speakers to provide their insights. And in the order that they will speak, you'll get to hear from Lana Breutman, JFNA's new Senior Vice President for Public Affairs, and Stephen Wolf, JFNA's Senior Tax Counsel, who will both offer national perspectives. Louisa Chafee, UJA Federation of New York's Senior Vice President for External Relations and Public Policy, along with Amy Kaplan, Vice President for External Affairs and Director of Government Relations for the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, will offer their insights on a local advocacy perspective from two very different parts of the country. And Shimon Fogel, President and CEO for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, will weigh in on COVID advocacy from a Canadian perspective. So one piece of housekeeping before we get started. If during one of these presentations you have a question for a speaker or want to raise a question for the entire panel, please direct it to us through the question function in Zoom, and we will get to as many of them as possible after we hear from the panelists. While the chat function will be available to share resources, we're not going to be looking there for your questions. So please stay with the question function. So I'm going to now turn this over to Alana Breutman, who will begin discussing the congressional outlook in the upcoming elections and how this will impact our priorities when we hear from each of the other panelists. And then we will hear from each of the other panelists before coming back together. Alana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for that introduction and for setting the stage. With about 8 days to go until next Tuesday, it's very hard to predict the election, as always. It's going to be hard to even know that evening what the election's results fully mean. So here are a few things. Everybody's pretty certain that the House will remain Democratic, but the Senate is in play. There are about 10 states, give or take, depending on the polls that you look at, that are truly in play where a flip from a Republican to a Democrat or a Democrat to a Republican is predicted, or the race is truly contested, with more Republican incumbents being contested than Democratic incumbents. Most polls don't predict an enormous change, but do tend to say that Senator Schumer of New York will be the next majority leader, while Senator McConnell of Kentucky will be the minority leader. But what does that mean? Democrats will need to flip a net of 4 Republican-held Senate seats to take the majority, or 3 if there's also a President Biden, which would allow his Vice President Kamala Harris to break the tie. As I said, there are few contested Democratic seats, and Doug Jones of Alabama is most likely to flip to the Republicans, but more contest in the Republican seats, which is why the Senate is being closely watched by people. What does this mean for our communal priorities? Well, this may be different in the lame duck versus the new Congress and the next administration term, which begin in January. Let's play out a few scenarios. If there's a blue sweep of all 3 chambers, Senate, House, and the White House, President Biden will have the opportunity to pass his top priorities. But that also means nothing is likely to happen in the lame duck, which is the time between the election and the end of the calendar year, when the Congress has to pass a new continuing resolution or a new appropriation, because right now the government is only funded through December 11th. COVID relief, infrastructure, and perhaps climate and healthcare bills will be on the menu for a President Biden who's able to pass his priorities with a blue House and a blue Senate. But only those issues that could be passed mainly with Democratic votes. What we saw in Obama's early years is that it will be difficult to pass major bipartisan changes. This may also mean that Democrats might finally do away with the rest of the filibuster to allow President Biden to press forward with his agenda with a simple majority. If the Senate and the White House elect different parties, which seems somewhat unlikely, but you never know, either president will have a path to only pass a more limited bipartisan set of priorities. For a Trump-Pelosi-Schumer negotiation, COVID relief may look more like the House package that we see today, given the President Trump's apparent willingness to come to an agreement over a larger relief package. However, for a Biden-Pelosi-McConnell negotiation, there will be very little incentive for Senate fiscal conservatives to agree to the big heroes package. The election lesson would really be that Senator McConnell and traditional Republican fiscal conservatives had a bigger win than perhaps the brand of Republican embodied in President Trump's messaging, which could make fewer Republican senators who are looking forward to their own 2022 midterm elections be willing to support a big spending package. If the election does not change leadership in the White House or the Senate, we essentially have the current policy playbook. There surely will be COVID relief, but it is more likely to look like a skinny bill than a more generous bill that we have seen to date. Because again, the more generous bill would simply have too high of a price tag for many fiscal conservatives thinking about the midterm election. What does this mean for the Jewish system and our priorities? Well, what it certainly means, like in every single new Congress or new administration, is that we have to double down and invest the time in partnership with professionals and volunteers across the country to leverage all of our advocacy tools. Any new administration and any new Congress are always an opportunity. First, they are reinvigorated, seeking to make policy input, a big policy imprint. Second, you're going to have new chairs and ranking members, no matter what happens, in some key committees. There are key retirements. In the House, you've got Lowy and Engel retiring. In the Senate, you've got Enzi and Roberts. All of these are key members for our of committees for our community. Also, new Republican and Democratic chairs reshape Republican and Democratic rules both require a reshaping of chairs and ranking orders, which will also mean even if somebody has not retired, every time you have a new chairman or chairwoman or a new ranking member, you have new staff coming in. These are the people who are the true experts in Congress who will work with advocates to really impact deeply legislation, policy, and regulation. And as new staff comes in, new blood, which means we have to get to know people all over again. And we rely on to do that, we rely on not just the people who sit in Washington, but the people who are located in every single state across the country who get to know their own members and the staff that they bring with them. Our ultimate goal is always to be bipartisan. And we believe that a number of our policies are indeed bipartisan in the support that they get, particularly security funding and anti-Semitism legislation like the IRA definition, and we'll have plenty of workshops and Fed Labs to get deeper into this. These are really bipartisan messages. Some of the policies that we support could be more partisan because they require more fiscal spending. But in a bad economy like we're facing during the pandemic, there is a bit more of an opportunity to get some bipartisan support, even for more high-ticket items. So what are Jewish Federations of North America doing about this new opportunity? We're building greater volunteer advocacy, as David has spoken about, and David is the main address for a lot of this. We're going to have a national mission February 1st and February 2nd, where we're going to ask communities all over the country to gather with us in sessions like this to speak to leadership in Congress and administration and other interesting speakers. We're deepening our partnerships with local communities to understand the needs that they have, but also the data they bring to the table, because it's that data that is critical to us making the arguments we need to make in Congress. And we're looking forward to building on the federal advocacy to support state and local advocacy agendas, because it's a partnership, and you all have seen during the pandemic how much state and local really matters. We look forward to working with all of you. We're always ready to answer any questions and to engage with you in doing this important work, and look forward to 2021. I will also just mention that at the end of the election week, on Friday, November 6th, we're going to have a post-election review with some really interesting journalists commenting on the election, and our own community experts talking about, now that we know who's taking some of these chairs, what does this actually mean? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alana. Now we'll turn the floor over to Stephen.
Thank you, David. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I want to just pull up some slides here and start my presentation. And David, can you see the slides?
Yep, your
Okay,
slides
great.
are on screen. You got it.
Great. And thank you, Alana, for kicking this off as well. Our advocacy on COVID relief really is a logical outgrowth of our continued involvement in the Washington Public Policy Office in Washington with our colleagues, as well as throughout the country, in partnership with major national charitable organizations. JF&A is a member of a group called Leadership 18, which is a organization of charities such as United Way, Red Cross, YMCA, YWCA, and many others that meet regularly the CEOs meet regularly to share their best practices and strategies. While it's not primarily an advocacy organization, Leadership 18 has spoken out on the importance of the charitable deduction. There's a group of public policy leads, my colleagues really in Washington, who meet regularly, at least each quarter, to discuss relevant legislative and regulatory issues. It just so happened we had planned a meeting in early March to outline a lobbying event on Capitol Hill for our CEOs to talk about the charitable deduction and expanding it in this Congress. That was just when the pandemic hit. Our group then quickly pivoted and began to meet and discuss ways to help the entire nonprofit sector cope with the pandemic. We started to meet each morning at 7:30 and have continued to meet daily for the past 8 months, every day talking about strategy, what we can do and how to move the ball forward. Our plan was to really focus on the nonprofit sector as a whole, its importance as an employer, the size of the sector, and how we were on the front line responding to the pandemic and needed specific relief. So we crafted a plan looking at our sector in general, looking at what other industries and other groups were doing. And we called for a multifaceted relief program asking for $60 billion. We put together a letter which was signed ultimately by over 4,000 nonprofits throughout the country asking for this relief. And you can see on the slide, Leadership 18 has a copy of the original letter which asked for that $60 billion of support to really help the most vulnerable among us. This was the top of the letter, and you can see that we included the logos of a variety of national charitable organizations, everything from the Alliance of American Museums all the way through the YMCA. And this really was, it spoke about the great breadth of our coalition and really what we were trying to achieve for the sector in general. Our letter basically called for, as I say, $60 billion in grants and loans. And we were starting to work in the Senate to basically look at what the Senate was drafting in early March as a COVID relief package. They were talking about business interruption programs. This ultimately evolved into the Paycheck Protection Program, which David was talking about earlier, with a limit of $10 million per organization, and also limitations on the number of employees that could be eligible in an organization, as well as a very, very key provision which would prohibit any organization eligible to receive Medicaid funding to be eligible for these loans or grants. A very, very important provision, something that we fought from day one. They also talked about making loans available for businesses and nonprofits, making charitable giving provisions much more available, and expanding it to an above the line deduction for those who were not able to claim the charitable deduction on their tax returns, a payroll tax delay for employers, including nonprofits, and also a COVID relief package of funding for state and local governments, all very important to us as providers of government contracts at the local level. So very key to both the federation system, our partners, as well as our other national nonprofits. So what did we do? We worked through the coalition with the bipartisan leadership in the Senate on this package. We worked with both Leader McConnell and Leader Schumer, although ultimately Leader Schumer really proved to be much more valuable for us as a leader for the nonprofit sector. We worked with other members that were key drafters of the program, including Senators Rubio of Florida and Cardin of the Small Business Committee, who were drafting what would become the Paycheck Protection Program. And we broadened our coalition as well. We started with a small group at 7:30. We then started to meet every day at 11:30 with a group that had more than 100 different charities represented. As we broadened the coalition, we broadened the reach of who we could contact both within the administration as well on Capitol Hill. We also got our public relations and communication colleagues involved. We started to have a fairly extensive communications program where we had a number of articles and social media campaigns, as well as television and radio spots, really focusing on the importance of the nonprofit sector, the services we were providing. Our own Eric Fingerhut was featured many, many times on interviews and throughout this campaign. So it was really a broad-based campaign looking at every aspect of lobbying and advocacy, really to move our program forward. So what was really the guts of what we were advocating for? It really became the CARES Act in middle of March that was passed unanimously by the Senate. The business interruption loan program really became the PPP program, as I said. The key provision that we fought from day one was a provision that would have disallowed many Jewish organizations and many other nonprofits, if they were eligible to receive Medicaid funding, from receiving these grants and loans, which ultimately can become forgivable loans or grants. There was also a 500 employee limit, which was a function of the SBA's usual limitations on making grants to organizations because of the size limitation based on normal SBA programs. There also was talk about limiting religious organizations to receive these loans. We reached out, used our contacts, talked a lot with key leaders around the country at different federations to make contacts with members on both sides of the aisle. We were able to remove the Medicaid disqualification from the program, a huge, huge lift and something that we thought was extremely important and something we've been very proud of, quite frankly. We also clarified that religious organizations, churches, synagogues were eligible for these grants and were able to get that included in the legislation. We tried to push for increasing the charitable giving provisions in the program, basically getting a above the line deduction to include 1/3 of the standard deduction amount that taxpayers can claim on their tax returns. We also made a key pitch to carve out specific funds for the nonprofit organizations, the same way as the airline industry and others were getting their carve-outs in the legislation. This was our message, a little hard to read on the slide, but the message that we sent out both to our federation and agency partners, as well as other Jewish organizations that had come together through the Jewish Together website. We had webinars on the legislation, made an extensive program to get this message out so that we could have a broad-based advocacy program at both the national and local level. As I said, we reached out to key members and really leaned heavily on our federation colleagues throughout the country. Government relation pros such as Amy and Louisa, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, were key to this effort. We reached out to federations in various parts of the country, in key states where members were located, key chairmen, key ranking members of committees, including members in New York, New Jersey, California, Ohio, Texas, Florida. It really was a national effort, and we again relied on the network that we've had for many, many years of key government relation pros and federations. And as I said, we also looked to key lay leaders, such as David Golder in Illinois, who made contacts with some of his contacts, including Senator Durbin. Other key lay leaders in Florida reached out and made contact to Senator Rubio. Obviously, Senator Schumer was key in New York. So these lay leaders who have important connections with government officials, both at the member level and also at the key staff level. and we'll hear some more about this from Amy and Luisa in a few minutes. They were really key to getting our message across. As I indicated, the major focus was on the Medicaid issue from our perspective, because that really would have knocked us out of the block for getting these forgivable loans in PPP. And I would be remiss without really thanking publicly Leader Schumer for his efforts, really including this issue as one of the last issues that was decided before the CARES Act was brought to the floor and passed unanimously on the Senate floor. His real advocacy to remove this provision was key for us, and we really can't thank him enough in terms of those dollars flowing to organizations throughout our community, as well as throughout the whole nonprofit community. The results, as I indicate, the Paycheck Protection Program, we estimate over $600 million has gone to Jewish organizations, federations, synagogues, day schools, even Jewish independent contractors were able to use this program and have used these loans, which will now ultimately become mostly forgivable loans and become really grants. We also carved out dollars for a loan program through the Federal Reserve called the Main Street Lending Program for nonprofits. And that's especially important for those organizations with over 500 employees who may not qualify for PPP. We did get an above the line charitable deduction into the tax law for the year 2020. We're trying to get that extended, but a key win from our perspective. Very importantly, we secured unemployment compensation relief. Many federations and other Jewish organizations, as well as nonprofits around the country, self-insure their unemployment compensation. And these costs would have made a huge cash flow problem for these organizations. We were able to get 50% of that compensation relief made available to nonprofits such as our federation partners. And finally, state and local funding, a huge chunk of money, over $500 billion in the CARES Act set for state and local funding, again, to assure state and local organizations could continue to meet their obligations, including the contracts that they've laid out with many, many Jewish organizations and agencies. So this was really a big win for the system, a big win for all of us working together. And without the work of all of us at both the national and local level and our national partners throughout the charitable sector, it really would not have happened. The work continues, as Alana talked about. Our advocacy has continued in both the HEROES and HEALS Act, really trying to get expanded PPP, a next round of PPP, expanding the charitable giving incentives to the year 2021, and making that unemployment compensation grow to over 100%, to 100%, I should say. We'll continue to work on this legislation. In fact, we had a meeting this morning and we talked about what we can do between now and even the election, working with Speaker Pelosi, as well as the administration on that next package to ensure that our wishes are included in the next bill. There are also some specific JF&A priorities, including an increase in Medicaid funding, which is vital to our system. Other programs like SNAP and other social service programs we'll continue to work on both during these next few days before the election, during the lame duck, and if necessary into 2021 as well. So that's sort of an outline of what we've done over the last several months and what we continue to do. So with that, David, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. What a really incredible story of bringing a team together and being able to have an exceptional impact in a positive way for our Federation network. So thanks for letting us revisit some of the work that was done. Now I'm going to turn the virtual microphone over to Louisa Chafee from New York. Louisa.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you all today in this Zoom era. I'm going to speak a little bit, and then Amy's going to speak about the more local experience. And first, I just wanted to start by saying, as you all know, the New York Federation is a large federation, and the landscape of nonprofits we work with is also really large. And so if we think about from a state and local perspective, for you all to understand the challenges we face, I think you need to understand that New York City government invests $6 billion in the health and human service, in the human service landscape, and New York State invests another $2 billion every year. So there's an enormous amount of money flowing from government, federal to the state, to the city, and then to nonprofits like the over 100 nonprofits that UJA is proud to work with. Coming into this fiscal year, even before COVID, because of changes in the Medicaid structure, New York State was facing some really major multi-billion-dollar shortfalls. So we were already going into the calendar year with the state concerned about addressing shortfalls. And then obviously the pandemic hit. So the change was enormous and rapid. I think the other thing you have to keep in mind about the landscape is that both New York City and New York State are mandated to have a balanced budget, and they now both have the ability to take balanced budgeting actions multi-times a year. So our landscape was an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of nonprofits doing services, frankly, an enormous amount of clients, both Jewish and served with Jewish values, a shortfall, and then the pandemic. So that's the landscape. What are the tactics we've used? We need to be humble. Normally, we scenario plan. We have priorities that we follow through the months of first state session and budget and then city session and budget. This is a really different environment. We need to recognize that while we scenario plan, we can really only have tactics day to day. We have learned to pivot and respond to truly the unanticipated or the most amazing, whether that has been our school system shutting on days' notice, our senior service system in New York City going through 9 different major policy changes in the course of a month. Our nonprofits are just riding a roller coaster, and we're right there with them, advocating to keep the system stable on the city and the state level. And so how do we do that? Meaning, what are the techniques, given that it's so hard to have a long-term strategic approach? Number one we have to emphasize is that we are grateful to all those who have for years built an incredibly strong network foundation. So that is relationships with many nonprofits and their leaders and their boards, relationships with government elected officials, but also relationships with government staff leads. And sometimes the staff are as critical, particularly with things moving so very fast. Also, in New York, as with many other states, there is a level of musical chairs so that people might move, for example, from a city government staff position to a city government elected position to the state assembly or senate, and then on to the federal to our congressional delegation. And so we have an increasing and very strong network, and maintaining that network has been critical. We want to recognize the incredible leadership of JFNA and the partnership that came from both coming to New York, being part of this with our congressional delegation, but also being able to go to JFNA with issues that were critical to New York that could be addressed through other parts of the National Federation. And we also need to recognize our lay leaders, so important both in those one-on-one relationships, but also at times important in the ability to bring together large groups to really voice importance. So for example, when there were calls to action, to have hundreds of New Yorkers be able to activate and reach out. And New York's UJA with 50,000 donors has a broad network, and so we've been able to activate a great many on really sudden notice. And we also need to recognize our New York City external partners. So just as Stephen spoke to the WISE and the United Way and that large group that they are working with in New York, we have both interfaith partners with Catholic Charities and our Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. We have many other, like 300 other critical social service nonprofits through various advocacy structures we interact with on a regular basis, and during COVID, we're responding and planning with, as much as possible, twice or 3 times a week. And we also, from the UJA perspective, moved into working with other philanthropic partners. So we participated in the Bloomberg and Ford Foundation COVID Response Fund. And so that sort of both took us from the service delivery perspective to the granting perspective, and working different angles of trying to think about all the different ways to keep the community stable, the nonprofit stable, to have the best services for clients in the just curve as it went up. And thinking through those tactics. Okay, so what are our challenges going forward? Well, I think sadly that virus continues. And while New York's rates are low right now, the weather's getting colder and we know it's coming back. Our city and state have really large fiscal shortfalls that cannot be addressed unless they take massive budget cuts and or there's federal state and local aid. As Stephen mentioned, it's a top priority, and on that level, we're really waiting to see what happens with the federal election, both with the Senate and with the executive. And as Alana laid out, there are a number of options that may come through, but there could be some really catastrophic impacts to the Jewish social service landscape in New York and to their clients and their employees if state and local aid does not come through. We also need to recognize the political landscape in New York State. Some of you may have noticed that our mayor and governor are not always besties, and that has impacts for everyone else and can present challenges simply in the navigation of how to deal with all the different funding partners. We also need to recognize the shifting political landscape in our New York congressional delegation. As was mentioned, we have some key New York Jewish, or some key New York congressional leaders who have been very strong on Jewish issues, retiring and stepping back. And we have an emerging branch of the party, the DSA, coming forward in New York State. And so we're working on network and relationship building even as we're working through this pandemic. So here we are, 8 days short of the federal election with implications. We need to recognize from the top of the congressional delegation the incredible importance of Senator Schumer in keeping New York and the rest of the country strong, and the impacts in both directions, and many other leaders in the New York delegation. We want to give a shout out to Hakeem Jeffries, who's done an incredible amount, really thinking about how Brooklyn speaks to the world and or speaks to the country in terms of examples from workers and clients and social services, whether those be within the Jewish community or beyond. We're waiting on the state and local aid issue. Some of the JF&A priorities are lesser priorities to UJA Federation simply because of how services are structured in this state, but we still recognize that as part of the national network, we need to address those priorities wherever possible. And so we look, we're all holding our breath, watching the poll numbers and seeing what comes forward, and looking forward to ongoing work and recognizing that it's not going to be easy, but it certainly will make each and every day an adventure.
Well, thank you, Louisa. Most appreciated. We'll come back to you, I'm sure, with questions as the panel goes on. So let me turn to another part of the country. Amy Kaplan from the Jewish Federation of Cleveland. Amy, the microphone's yours.
Thank you, David. And thank you to my co-panelists. Much of what happens here in Ohio happens just like it does in New York, as Louisa described. But let me give you a taste of what Ohio is like and how different it is than New York. Ohio is traditionally, in presidential elections, a swing state, a bellwether state, though in recent years it has trended more right, but not far right. But you wouldn't know that from looking at our legislature, because our legislature has Republican caucuses with veto-proof majorities in both the House and the Senate, the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate, as a result of the redistricting and the gerrymandering that occurred after the last census. We have a moderate Republican governor, Governor Mike DeWine, and When COVID hit, Governor DeWine quickly emerged as one of the foremost leaders in battling the virus in the country. He was very quick to shut the state down in mid-March, and he had a public health director, Dr. Amy Acton, who many of you might know because she was often on national television, who had become basically a national rock star on advising Ohioans on what they needed to do to combat the COVID virus and to stay safe. She has since retired, but it is, to me, a testament to Governor DeWine's leadership and his willingness to listen to all voices that he really got Ohio in a very good place early on in this pandemic. To do that, though, he had to battle and continues in some respects to battle his own Republican caucus in the legislature. Not the leadership of his caucus, but members of the caucus who very much opposed the shutdown, the mask mandate that the governor imposed over the summer, and who were urging for an earlier and broader opening in the state. You may have read that some of these members of the Republican caucus are even trying to impeach Governor DeWine. It won't happen. The Republican leadership in the legislature won't allow it to happen. And Governor DeWine enjoys wide support throughout the state in how he's handled this. But that said, we're now facing rising cases. There's more political unrest here than there ever has been. And the governor's just this past week has been all over the place with Zoom calls and press conferences expressing his concern about our growing case rate. So that's the political environment we're operating in. But just like Louisa indicated in New York, there are a number of similarities between New York and Ohio, because basically government relations in any time, in a time of a pandemic like this, or in normal times, is always the same. It is always about relationship building. It is always about understanding what your legislative priorities are based on the needs of your community and building support for those priorities among policymakers. So first, like New York, there is an overwhelming need in Ohio for additional state and local government relief, which so far has not been part of COVID relief legislation coming out of the Congress. And without it, because Ohio, like New York, like basically every state, has to have a balanced budget, there will be significant shortfalls. And getting that state and local government relief is understandably Governor DeWine's highest priority in his dealings with Congress and in what he hopes for in the next COVID relief package. The second priority, and a very high priority for JF&A, as you've heard, is an increase in the federal Medicaid assistance percentage, or FMAP. This is the amount of money that the federal government contributes to each state for their Medicaid programs. It was increased in an early COVID relief legislation, and we are hoping as a federation movement for an additional increase of about 6% or so, and that was actually provided for in the HEROES Act, which it has been passed by the House, but has not been taken up by the Senate. This is indeed a high priority for the Cleveland Federation, but we learned that we needed to pivot, and that's because the governor essentially sent out the message to us that he was willing to provide our nursing home providers with significant increased Medicaid support to the tune of $50 per bed per day through the rest of this budget cycle, which ends on June 30th of 2021, if we in turn did not pressure him on Medicaid increases and advocating for FMAP increases. And we were left with the position of FMAP has always been a high priority for us, but here we were being offered this aid by the governor that we really couldn't turn down. And our providers told us that the governor's offer was much more valuable to them over the next 8 to 9 months than the effect of an FMAP increase would have been. So here we are in the federation system supporting generally the need for an FMAP increase and lobbying for that when we speak with our senators and our House congressional delegation. But on the ground here, we are working with the governor to get aid that our providers desperately need. And that takes us in a slightly different direction than the federation system as a whole. And it's this flexibility and the need to pivot in coordination with understanding what our needs on the ground here in Ohio are that really has marked this era more than any other time that I've been doing government relations. And I've been doing it for 14 years. But there are also government relations strategies that are a through line that we need to rely on no matter what era we find ourselves in, including this era of the pandemic. As Louisa said, one is the constant development of relationships with our elected officials and their staff. And we do that year round. And we do it here in Ohio in partnership with Ohio Jewish Communities, a 501c4 organization that we in Cleveland formed about 28 years ago, and that represents all of the Ohio federations. We find that that's the most effective way for us to advocate in Ohio, because for the foreseeable future, all of the political power in Ohio will rest with our downstate Republicans. And we here in Cleveland, who are surrounded by Northeast Ohio Democrats, need help in developing those downstate relationships. And that's what OJC does for us. And OJC has done an amazing job in partnership with us. We are their largest funder in developing relationships with members of the Ohio legislature who, one, eventually go on to serve in Congress, and two, don't often understand our legislative priorities. So we constantly are working to help them understand the needs of the Jewish community, who we are. We support an Ohio legislative mission to Israel that until COVID went every year, and that has resulted in legislators who not only learn to love Israel, but learn about us as a community and learn to know us and learn to trust us. So when we have issues that we need their support on, they're there for us. Those kinds of constant relationship cultivation continue. Like Louisa said, we also rely on our Federation lay leaders who themselves have important relationships with many elected officials to join us in our advocacy, and they are almost always very generous in doing so and in offering us access to people that we sometimes need access to. An example of how all of this came together just on Friday is that on Friday afternoon, Governor DeWine announced that he is today pulling down an additional $426 million in CARES Act funding, which he would otherwise have to forfeit if it went unused by the end of this year, and is directing a significant amount of that towards some of our community's priorities. For example, there's a $25 million being directed toward helping nonprofits cover their unemployment insurance claim, because nonprofits typically self-insure for unemployment and are, as a result of the pandemic and the changes in their staffing, facing significant claims. The governor has stepped in to help with that. And that is in part because he has listened to nonprofit leaders like Ohio Jewish Communities, like the Cleveland Federation, the Columbus Federation, the Cincinnati Federation, all the Ohio federations, and other nonprofit service providers on their really significant need for relief. So that's the landscape in Ohio. And I guess I would sum it up by saying everything is different, but not that much has changed except for the need to pivot quickly and understand the facts on the ground as they change. Government relations is government relations. It's all about relationship building. It's all about keeping people involved. And it's all about helping elected officials understand the needs of our community. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Amy. Really some great stories from New York and Ohio, a lot of similarities. Let's now look a little bit north and ask Shimon Fogel from CIJA in Canada to give us the Canadian perspective.
David, thanks so much for inviting me to join with you in the session. I'm mindful that the best presentations are the shortest, so I'm going to limit my comments to just 4 brief points, and I look forward to any discussion that we can have for the second half of the program. Let me just start with a one-line explanation of who we are, especially for our US cousins who may not be familiar with CEJA. If you think of wrapping all the JCRCs, JFNA's Israel Action Network, AIPAC, and the Conference of Presidents into one package, well, that would be us, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. We're the advocacy agent for the Jewish Federations of Canada. And while there are other organizations like B'nai B'rith, Simon Wiesenthal Center, and JSpace who engage in aspects of the public affairs space, CEJA is the principal interlocutor with all levels of government, the broader political sector and media, and the only registered lobby at either the provincial or federal levels. So like the other panelists, I would acknowledge readily that COVID has brought a myriad of challenges to our community, and in some ways, at least temporarily, has changed the ways in which we do things. I'd like to point to the following areas that have dominated our advocacy agenda over, let's say, the last 8 months. The first, obviously, is COVID relief directly. When things shut down in Canada back in March, federations immediately understood the implications for our community, from campaign to poverty relief, the acutely vulnerable like Holocaust survivors, the very survival of communal institutions like JCC, schools, camps, and the like. So CEJA's first task was to ensure that the community had access to all of the government relief programs, and I admit that they pale in comparison to the scope of the ones that you talk about in the United States. But they include those directed at institutions as well as those directed to individuals in terms of employment support. The one area we didn't have to deal with was the healthcare sector because of our universal healthcare system that exists here north of the border. So this prompted us to work hand in glove with the broader charities and not-for-profit sector, and our long-term investment in partnerships with non-Jewish interlocutors paid substantial dividends. And frankly, it echoes the experience described by Ilana and Stephen Wolf. So it translated for us into tens of millions being directed to communal enterprises, including federations, and also resulted in a dedicated $350 million fund exclusively to the charitable sector, which again accrued support for numerous COVID-related projects within our own community. But one of the most important outcomes for us is that by accessing federal and provincial support, we were able to protect the Federation's ability to steward their own resources for other emergent challenges within the community. The second is related, and it's about organizational support. Because in our experience, securing access to all of these programs was essential, but essentially irrelevant if the agencies, organizations, and institutions did not apply for support or didn't know how to apply for support, and therefore could never access the funds that were made available by governments. So navigating the system is not in the normal terms of reference or experience of communal agencies, at least in the Canadian experience. So second priority has been supporting our constituency through seminars, walkthroughs, guided templates, and troubleshooting their individual application processes. Serving as the reference, guide, and support has been a critical element for the successful management of the COVID crisis for all of the organizations here in Canada. The third area is liaison with public health, and it's a function that continues to this day. While I appreciate that in the American experience, buy-in and adherence to pandemic protocols is a bit of a contentious issue, in Canada, the issue is far less political, but it still requires extensive consultation, coordination, and compliance vigilance. CEJA emerged as the principal interlocutor with public health authorities at all levels of government, federal, provincial, and municipal, coordinating with officials, serving as their interlocutor and advisor as it related to the particular challenges and circumstances of the Jewish community, and guiding the community in terms of compliance and challenges. This has been an ongoing effort and will remain a priority until the pandemic recedes. One last point. Notwithstanding all of the challenges related to COVID, and has been mentioned just a little earlier in the discussion, online hate remains a predominant preoccupation for us. Many issues that normally feature prominently on our agenda have receded, if not to the margins, then at least second-tier status. But the one area that has remained central on our radar is the issue of anti-Semitism, and in particular, online hate. I don't have to elaborate for anyone on this call about the challenges growing steadily, especially during this time of COVID, whether it's on the right, the left, or within the Muslim community. And the explosion against systemic racism has in some ways served to complicate this file even more. That said, David, we've leveraged the circumstances of the last number of months to generate more activity about, attention to, and redress of hatred, including anti-Semitism in all of its forms, none being more pernicious rather than online hate. So in short, it's been an enormously busy and challenging time, but it's also been exceptionally rewarding, especially insofar as the efficacy and value of partnering with the Jewish community has been expressed by so many beyond the Jewish community. I'll leave it there, David, and turn it back to you. Thanking you again for inviting me to participate.
Thanks, Shimon. We so appreciate getting a broader perspective than many of us are used to receiving. Let me say now, I want to first thank all of our panelists, but now we're going to move to a point where we can answer a few questions. Remind you again to please make use of the Q&A function on Zoom if there's anything that's of interest to you. I'm going to start, and maybe I'll just take it back to Shimon for a moment. Shimon, we talk a lot in the United States about the partnership between volunteer leadership and the professionals as it relates to building relations and lobbying with government officials. Is that a similar scenario as one might look at in the Canadian approach?
So yes, with the following caveat, David. You know, I think that we have to recognize that we are more or less proportionate to the American experience. So when you talk about numbers, we are a 10th of the population. We deal with 10th in terms of 10% of the money and so forth. But our system is much more coordinated and does not reflect the kind of differences that you experience in the States. And if you just recall the distinctions made between the experience in New York and Ohio, even though all of our communities are unique, the coordination and consolidation of interests between them is much easier to achieve. So we're generally a professionally driven enterprise, but we rely heavily on our lay leadership and the engagement of the grassroots to support and complement the kind of messages and objectives that we set out both at the federal and provincial levels.
Thank you so much. Now let me turn, I'm going to go to Louisa first and then Amy with the same question. Under the, we know how important the partnership between volunteer leadership and the professionals are. I think you both mentioned it. Under this umbrella of COVID, what special work have you had to take on to continue to provide for network communication, building relationships with your volunteer community? What are the things that have become more difficult, and maybe some techniques you've used to improve communication, especially with that volunteer group? Louisa?
Thank you, David. Well, I guess Zoom is the first answer. We didn't used to do everything by Zoom, and now we do. But on a serious note, I think what we've worked really hard, both with our close lay leaders and then, you know, our executive committee, our board, and larger groups, are keeping them in the loop so that they understand the enormously swiftly changing landscape and the challenges, and at the same time, both turning to lay leaders who we know are engaged and opening up the door for lay leaders who might want to be engaged in the very specific circumstances. And as we said, we've had just a myriad of challenges. So we have day school challenges and kosher food access challenges and massive unemployment. And so it's sort of, there's room for plenty of information sharing. It's just sped the whole cycle up and really made us think about how to keep our key partners in the loop as this cycle is speeding.
Thank you. Amy.
So in Cleveland, we have a robust government relations committee at the Federation that I staff, and that is chaired by a wonderful, strong lay leader, Brad Schlang. And what we have found is that during COVID, Zoom has actually been our friend. We had a meeting just a couple weeks ago, and because of Zoom, we were able to have Ilana Breutman and John Weston and other staff from JFNA in DC and Howie Bagelman from Ohio Jewish Communities, not only be on the Zoom with us, but speak to our whole group. Before, we would never have conferenced in that many people who don't live in Cleveland at the same time. The other thing we have found through this committee, which consists of the executive director and board chair of all of our agencies, and about 15 members at large who are politically active and active with Federation as well. At this meeting, we broke the group into breakout rooms and asked them to talk about their priorities, legislative priorities, what their needs were. And what we found was that in each room, we had people representing day schools, people representing providers like our nursing homes and JFSA. We had people from the JCC, and we had these members at large, some of whom didn't have strong agency connections. And what they realized was they had many issues in common that they didn't know before. And I think what that will help us do is create even tighter and more robust joint advocacy going forward. The other thing we're planning, because we can't get together in person, are Zoom gatherings probably every 6 to 8 weeks, and not starting until after the presidential election, where we can invite strategically important elected officials, both at the federal level and the state level, to speak to our group. Before, that would have been much more difficult to get them to Cleveland to actually have a meaningful dialogue. Now everybody's used to Zoom. We can invite people who don't need to get on a plane to come to Cleveland. And so we've found that to be a really great advantage. And I think it has energized the people in our lay advocacy community to be able to have access to these people.
Thank you. A side benefit to a very difficult situation. Let me go. We've got a few questions that have come in from our webinar audience. The first one, I think I'm going to turn to Stephen Wolf. So Stephen, if you can be prepared regarding support for SNAP and other food programs, who are our partners and what are their primary goals for our advocacy around food needs? This is from Len Zuckrow, and Len is on the board of his regional food bank.
That's a great question. Thanks, David. Thanks for the question. It's really amazing how many of the national charities and local charities have a shared interest in many of the social service programs, including SNAP. Obviously, groups like Feeding America, the YMCA's that have food programs as well, United Way, which supports many food programs. So there are a lot of partners nationally. There are coalitions within DC that we've been working with, a Coalition on Human Needs, very interested in poverty programs and hunger programs. SNAP and many of the social service programs really bind our coalition together and are part of the many issues that we try to push forward to ensure that nonprofits continue to receive the funding for these programs to ensure that we can help the most vulnerable every day.
Hey, thanks, Stephen. And while I have you online, I think this is probably best for you from Jay Jacobson. What is the advocacy group doing for a pending stimulus package? And if there is no stimulus before January, what will change potentially if there's a democratically controlled Senate?
Thanks. Another great question. As I think I indicated a little bit in my presentation, we continue to meet every day. We continue to lobby every day, including today, to try really to perfect the bills that are pending now and the negotiations that are pending now. And it's really still a bipartisan effort. And in some cases, the Republican plans are better on different issues, like charitable giving, for example. We have although it's a bipartisan issue, really one of our key advocates is Senator Langford, a Republican on the Senate Finance Committee, and Senator Scott, a Republican on the Finance Committee. If that committee flips, Senator Coons will be our advocate post-election. But we try to perfect these programs, try to make sure that the language is really as beneficial as it can be for nonprofits. For example, there's a definition of gross profits, which will impact how nonprofits will be able to get the next set of PPP loans or employee retention tax credits. So we're trying to make sure that that definition is the best, and it differs between the House and the Senate. So we'll continue our efforts all the way through, but clearly after the election, some of our strategy will change. We have a letter signed that will be signed by a huge group of nonprofits ready to go to the transition team if the Biden administration is to be inaugurated in January. We will continue to work with the current administration, depending on what happens. Clearly, the makeup of the Senate will also impact our lobbying efforts, but we'll continue to work with both sides of the aisle. But clearly, we'll have to, again, make some changes and potentially some additional modifications to our lobbying, depending on whether or not, for example, if Mr. Cardin is the chairman of the Senate Small Business Committee, that will make it a little bit easier to get PPP changes that we're trying to get through than if Senator Rubio retains the chairmanship. So it'll depend on the election, but we'll continue to work with our local federation allies as well as our national charity allies.
Thanks, Stephen. I've got a question for Amy Kaplan from Bob Yass. Bob is a member of our DPGA Council. The question is, if it seems like you had to balance existential questions in considering the governor's offer based on the story you told, yet it did not seem like it was the preferred approach. How did you process that for the community decision-making? What sort of information did you share?
That's a really interesting question. So our community decision-making here at the Cleveland Federation is a little different on issues of what we call public affairs issues, the kinds of issues that our Community Relations Committee, which is separate from our Government Relations Committee, deals with all the time. Issues relating to voting rights, gun violence, things like that. The Federation processes those issues very carefully and according to a very defined set of protocols that we adopted in 2017, so that there is community consensus and there's a lot of sharing as we make those decisions. On these issues, which I like to call bottom line issues, issues that affect the amount of funding coming into our agencies or into the Federation itself, we don't seek community consensus, and we really work most closely in this case with our providers. When our providers were telling us that the governor's offer was much more valuable to them than an FMAP increase would have been, we couldn't advocate in opposition to that. We had to accept that and go with what was best for them. So here in Cleveland, we really process and share information differently depending on whether it's a funding issue or whether it's a community relations kind of issue.
Thank you so much. So I have a question from Keith Livin from Ohio, and Keith is also a member of our DPGA Council. I'm gonna ask this of Louisa from a local perspective. from Alana from a national perspective, and then also go back to Shimon and see if he can give us a perspective from his organization. And so what are, with challenges to our continuing advocacy efforts pertaining to community security, anti-Semitism, Israeli security needs, and given the resources that our social service programs desperately need to deal with as it relates to COVID, how can we use this crisis to activate more participation in our advocacy efforts? So I think Keith is looking at that broader perspective on how to continue to activate the community. So maybe Louisa, can you give us your first start at that?
Sure, and thank you. So we definitely deal with this challenge, or the challenge of multiple co-presenting really important issues, and that security should not be put on the back burner, or anti-Semitism. But what we have found, and as I spoke to, is in the relationship building, a great deal has to do with telling the stories. And so bringing forward to critical deciders relevant examples from impacted communities, from social service organizations that speak to issues. So, for example, it might be during the very unpleasant JCC bomb threat series, we had some of our senior centers being threatened. And so that was an opportunity to show both vulnerable seniors, low-income seniors, and why social service organizations in general are not highly hardened in their design. And so having government officials think about that, you might need to focus on food supports, on combating isolation, on providing strong community ties, and on security, all in one place. And so, as Amy said, we're now in the Zoom era, and she spoke to the challenge of being able to bring lots of people together. And we have actually been thinking and finding ways to have camera crews go out and film organizations that are doing in-person services with all appropriate protocols of masking in place, so that we can show people, here's what's happening, and here's why multiple issues can continue to be really important and of great importance to the community. So I guess we're trying to tell the story visually, bring together data that speaks to the story, and life is seldom one thing alone, and just reminding people that COVID has amplified existing needs, existing disparities, and it's all the more acute in this era. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Alana.
Thanks, David, and could not agree more with what Louisa said, and I'll add to it, but let me just underline what she said. It's always so critical to both have the data and the human stories to tell, and this is a time when, if there's a silver lining, the ability to be able to get these stories out to so many more lawmakers is something that we should really leverage, and especially when it comes to talking about people who are more vulnerable, who are harder to get to Washington. The Holocaust survivors, for example, who might be quite elderly. This is our opportunity to tell those stories even more so. And again, just as another example, before I add to what Louisa said, in February, we always have had a Jewish Disabilities Advocacy Day, where people from around the country would come into Washington. That's more challenging for some than others, including how far away you are from Washington. In 2021, we're going to have a Jewish Disabilities Advocacy Month. Can you imagine how many more people can tell their stories to how many more lawmakers about this critical issue? And then let me just say, to add to what Louisa was saying, which is, luckily for us, the Hill, as well as the administration, is divided with across a lot of decision makers. So in fact, security is decided by a couple of committees that have nothing to do with a couple of the other committees that deal with COVID relief or tax issues or Medicaid. Yes, it all has to come together, and people have to barter for dollars and cents and bills. That's every single piece of legislation that that impacts our community, or almost every single legislation. But we know that leadership, whether it's the president or Senate or House leadership, really relies on the expertise of the committees or the agencies to craft this important legislation. And that gives us an opportunity, and that's the power of our system. It gives us an opportunity to work with those chairs or those ranking or those administration officials that look at these issues very deeply, but also come from around the country. I mean, Amy and Louisa sit in states with very important leaders, but they're not the only ones. And we literally have federations or network communities or other Jewish institutions and communities that have a constituency relationship with people in Washington who make these decisions. So I don't think that we have to think about it as a trade-off at all, because we uniquely have that opportunity to speak about all of these issues in very tactless and very meaningful ways.
Thank you, Ilana. Shimon.
So David, I'd really only echo what both Louisa and Ilana, who's my newest pen pal, have said. Stories are very, very powerful, and we try and engage our grassroots constituencies in sharing those stories with decision makers at all levels of government. On the issue of community security, we've just had the government launch a new round of what we call SIP, Security Infrastructure Program, which is similar to the one that is funded through Homeland Security in the States. And that is also a touch point and an opportunity to engage local institutions in ways that really give them a sense of ownership of their own institutions, of the security of their constituency, their members, the children in their school or what have you. And we look for opportunities for them to be engaged in tangible ways. The one thing that I will flag and invite people to go onto the website to check out is a new initiative that we've begun called Must Speak. And it really seeks to address anti-Semitism in all of its different forms. And it is a coalition of 34 and counting different organizations who have come together. They can access pooled resources to help fund new initiatives to turn the dial on anti-Semitism, to collaborate together, to engage the grassroots in their own communities. And we're hoping that Must Speak is going to be a vehicle that will truly tap into the richness of skills, experience, and engagement throughout the country in order to really move the benchmark on anti-Semitism and engage thought leaders as well as other communities in joining in the battle against it.
Thank you, Shimon. We've got two more questions. The first one from Robin Gottlieb about finding a balance between COVID relief and national debt. And I'm going to hand that to Ilana, the keeper of all things at a federal level.
Thanks, David. Thank you for that question, because it's a tough one. We know that this is always a trade-off in any kind of appropriation. And no less this year, when the amount of funding that's been needed for COVID relief has just been astronomical. It's an issue, as I had said in my opening remarks, that's going to be very much the discussion and the sort of the political ball in the air after the election. And I don't think anybody here can really respond to it. But that's where I think we're going to see the tug of war, particularly. Well, maybe both in the House, but particularly in the Senate, as we move to any future COVID relief. Thanks for that question.
Thanks, Ilana. Shimon, while we still have you, we do have a question here. Someone's looking for the website for the Canadian Anti-Semitism Program. So if there's a way to share that on the chat, that would be great.
I'll do that right now.
Thank you. We're going to take one last question. Howie Beagelman from Ohio has asked, is there any opening without losing the funds and focus we need for operations and services to get innovative changes in care or provisions of services paid for or by federal funds? Are there pilots and proof of concept, other things we can be doing in terms of our advocacy? I can look to Stephen or Alana, whichever one of you wants to take on this last question.
If you don't mind, I might, and I also, if you don't mind, David, would certainly invite Amy and Louisa if they want to say a word, because just two things to mention. One, as our colleague John Weston likes to talk about, telehealth and how the support for addressing all kinds of healthcare without having to be in person has really grown in importance this year. And Amy and Louisa might want to comment on that. And the other I will say is the recognition of that poverty has grown, unfortunately, for more of the population, including the Jewish population. And Stephen and other colleagues are doing really important work on that around tax policy. So let me stop in case Amy.
Yeah, if Amy or Louisa have a comment on that.
So I'll take a stab at it. Since Howie is my colleague here in Ohio, I think, he knows this even better than I do, but I agree. We are always looking for pilot programs, especially at our nursing homes and at our Jewish Family Services Association, to participate in. Telehealth has become very, very important here. And I see that only growing. We all see it only growing, even after the pandemic is over. Like Zoom, we've all learned that a lot of things can be done without being actually in the same room as each other. And we are always looking to create and help support the creation of and participate in those kinds of pilots. Similar with aging in place pilots and things like that. It's critically important, and we actually count on John Weston and his staff to alert us to the opportunity to do that, to the piles of money that might be out there, and to the advocacy that's needed to create those pilot programs. So it's a partnership between the states and JFNA's DC office. We could not do this work without them.
And I was going to say exactly that, Amy, which is the frontline providers may have concepts and ideas that could be taken to scale, but we really need JFNA to help us match those opportunities to the frontline thinking. I do think that COVID has spurred innovation, telehealth. I think there's also great change in the food pantry system and in client choice services and in thinking really about the various intersections of food programs as one addresses food insecurity. And I'd like to believe that the new administration, whoever those may be, could move beyond the current tenor and really focus on thinking about how to help Americans. So we look forward to doing our part in that. Thank you.
Alana, you had one more thought?
One more thought, which is, I just realized I only thought very narrowly, but in a way, with COVID, with all of us being online all the time, has had wonderful benefits, and connectivity has also had more, exposed more problems of, for example, anti-Semitism online, hate groups that could actually engender physical insecurity. And so I know that my colleagues working on these things, Rob Goldberg and Stephanie Hausner, are thinking about them and also thinking about what kind of federal advocacy we need to engage in to address these issues. This is all work that they're thinking about very actively with colleagues in the field. But I do want to acknowledge that as we talk across the field, anti-Semitism and security have only risen in significance. I think that they are being impacted by what we've seen in 2020 with the pandemic, and it is part and parcel of how we're developing our policy.
Thanks, Alana, and thank you to all of our panelists. It is time for us to start to wrap up, and I apologize if there are any other questions still sitting out there, we've run out of time. But all of our panelists provided this incredible perspective and expertise on advocacy. And I know I learned a lot from this workshop, and I hope all of you did as well. I just have a couple of announcements as we wrap up today. First, if you enjoyed today's session, there is more to the GA. Our Jewish Together plenary is at 1:30 Eastern. And then there's another series of workshops that begin at 3:30 Eastern. And so you can find details to all these programs and how to join them on the GA webpage. A few announcements on behalf of our Public Affairs Division. Alana mentioned a few of them. Let me click in with a little more detail. For those of you that care about the upcoming US elections, I would think almost everybody on this call, JFNA will be convening a post-election analysis session discussing what the outcome will mean for the Jewish communities and the US-Israel relationship. And so we hope you'll join us on Friday, November 6th at 11 Eastern, and we'll hear from CNN analyst Bakari Sellers and JTA Washington Bureau Chief Ron Campius and other guest speakers who will give us some insights into how the election might impact our public policy agenda. Second, Alana also mentioned our first national virtual mission to Washington will begin on the evening of February 1st and conclude on February 2nd. We expect it to be exciting and engaging, and please keep your eyes open for invitations and information about that event coming up in February. And also in February, again, mentioning that look for information about our Jewish Disability Advocacy Month. So we hope you will be able to participate in each and every one of these programs. And we look forward to seeing you at other parts of the GA workshops and the plenary session. Have a great day, and thanks for joining us today.